and armchair travelers. Ever been on a stretch of road where the air just feels different? Like the asphalt itself is humming a tune only you can hear? Or maybe you've had one of those moments, out there on the open highway, when a gut feeling tells you to hit the brakes even when there's no logical reason to? If you have, drop a comment below and tell me about it. Because what I'm about to tell you happened back in '94, on old Route 66, and it still rattles my bones like a bad set of kingpins. My name's Frank Miller, but most folks on the CB called me Big Rig. Been hauling freight across this great nation since I was old enough to shave twice a day. That year, '94, was just like any other. Long hauls, greasy spoons, endless miles of blacktop. I was running a load of, well, let's just say it was sensitive cargo. Something that needed a direct, no-detour run from Chicago all the way out to LA. And that meant the mother road, Route 66. Now, I'd driven that stretch 1,000 times, knew every diner, every gas station, every speed trap from Illinois to California. It was just another job, another paycheck. Or so I thought. I pulled my Peterbilt, the iron horse, onto the shoulder, the air brakes hissing like a pissed-off rattlesnake. The old man didn't move, just watched me. He was thin, weathered, with a beard that looked like it had seen more dust than a desert highway. His clothes were rags, but his eyes were clear, sharp, like he saw right through the chrome of my truck and into my soul. I cut the engine, the silence of the Illinois countryside suddenly deafening after hours of engine roar. "Everything all right, old-timer?" I hollered, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. He just nodded slowly, then pointed a bony finger at the passenger door. Now, I ain't one to pick up strangers. Too many stories out there, too many ways to get yourself into trouble. But like I said, there was something about this fella. A quiet authority, almost. So, against my better judgment, I leaned over and popped the lock. He opened the door, slow and deliberate, and climbed in. Didn't say a word, just settled into the seat, smelling faintly of campfire smoke and old rain. He mumbled his name was Silas when he first got in, but as the miles rolled by, I learned his real name was Clark Thompson. 61 years old, with a beard as white as a winter highway and eyes that had seen too much. He took the coffee I offered, his hands trembling slightly, but his gaze never left my face. "You're a good man, Frank Miller," he rasped, his voice like gravel on a dirt road. "But goodness ain't always the truth." And that's when he started talking. About things I'd never considered. Things that once heard you can't unhear. Things that make you question everything you thought you knew about the world, about people, about yourself. He told me a truth, right there at mile 87, that no man, not a single one, ever wants to hear. At first, his words were like static on the CB, just background noise. He'd talk about folks, about how they treated each other, about the little cuts and bruises people inflict without even thinking. "Frank," he rasped, his voice still gravelly but with a surprising clarity, "you spend enough time on this road. You see the best of humanity, but you also see the worst. And the worst ain't always the big, flashy crimes. It's the quiet indifference, the way we turn a blind eye, the way we forget we're all just trying to make it to the next truck stop." I just nodded, trying to focus on the road ahead. My mind was on my schedule, on the hum of the engine, on anything but the heavy truth Clark was laying out. I'd seen my share of tough breaks, sure, but I always figured people were mostly good. He was talking about something deeper, something about the very essence of us, about why we hurt each other, why empathy feels like a forgotten language. He wasn't pointing fingers at any one group, just at the human heart itself. He spoke of authorities, not specific ones, but the systems that grind people down, the coldness that can seep into institutions, the way power can corrupt even the purest intentions. It was unsettling, like driving through a thick fog where you know there's a cliff edge somewhere but you can't quite see it. My gut told me to change the subject, to talk about the weather or the price of diesel, but something in his gaze, something in the quiet conviction of his words, kept me listening, even as my mind tried to reject it all. This wasn't just some old hobo rambling. This was a man speaking from a place of profound, painful knowledge, a place I was about to be dragged into, whether I liked it or not. We drove on, the sun now fully set, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the darkness. Clark kept talking, not in a preachy way, but like he was just narrating the world as he saw it, a world stripped bare of its illusions. And the more he talked, the more I started to see it too. He told me stories, not just abstract ideas, but real-life examples from his own past. He'd been a man of means, he said, once upon a time. A successful businessman, built an empire from the ground up, only to have it crumble not by bad luck or poor choices, but by the very people he'd trusted, the ones he'd helped with a generous heart. He spoke of partners who manipulated contracts, friends who spread vicious rumors to steal clients, and even family members who saw his kindness as a weakness to exploit, draining his resources dry with false promises and fabricated emergencies. They saw kindness as weakness, Frank. He sighed, looking out at the passing fields, his voice a low rumble. And they took everything, every last dime, every last shred of dignity. They left me with nothing but the clothes on my back and the truth in my heart. But you know what? I don't regret it, because it showed me the truth no man wants to hear, that the capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for pure, unadulterated malice lives in all of us. And it's always lurking, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike, often from the people you least expect. His words hit me like a sudden downshift on a steep grade, rattling my whole rig. I started thinking about my own life, about the times I'd been quick to judge, quick to dismiss, quick to put my own needs first, about the arguments I'd let fester, the apologies I'd never given, the I love yous I'd left unsaid to folks who were no longer around. Have you ever had a moment like that, folks, where someone says something and it just clicks and suddenly you're replaying your whole life, seeing it through a different lens? That's what Clark was doing to me. He wasn't just talking about the world. He was talking about my world, my actions, my inactions. He spoke of how easy it is to lose empathy, to become hardened by the road, by life, by the constant grind. He talked about the small betrayals, the everyday slights, the way we prioritize convenience over compassion, how we build walls instead of bridges, and as we passed a rundown old truck stop, its neon sign flickering like a dying ember, casting long, dancing shadows, I saw a few figures huddled in the shadows just like Clark had been. Maybe they were just waiting for a ride, or maybe they were just trying to stay warm. And for the first time, I didn't just see them as anonymous faces. I saw people, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own capacity for both good and bad, for being both the victim and the perpetrator of those quiet cruelties Clark was talking about. And I knew right then that this conversation, this unexpected detour, was going to change everything. It was like he'd flipped a switch in my brain, and suddenly the world looked sharper, harsher, but also clearer. And that clarity was a heavy burden to carry. The miles kept rolling, but the road felt different now. Every truck stop we pulled into, every face I saw, every interaction, Clark's words echoed in my head. It was like he'd given me a new set of eyes, or maybe just cleaned the grime off the ones I already had. I'd always seen the world in black and white, good guys and bad guys, honest work and shady deals. But Clark, he was painting in shades of gray I never knew existed. He talked about the little deaths we inflict on each other every day, the casual dismissal, the judgment in a glance, the way we prioritize our own comfort over someone else's dignity. It ain't always about stealing money, Frank, he'd say, his voice soft but firm. Sometimes it's about stealing hope or self-worth, and that's a debt that's harder to repay. I remember one stop, a busy truck plaza just outside of Springfield, Missouri. Place was buzzing, rigs coming and going, drivers grabbing coffee, shooting the breeze. I was stretching my legs, and Clark was just sitting on the passenger seat watching. A young kid, maybe early 20s, came up to me, eyes darting, asking if I had any spare change. Said his rig broke down a few miles back and he was trying to get home. My first thought, the old Frank thought, was, another one of these guys, probably just looking for a handout for booze. I was about to wave him off, give him the usual sorry buddy, can't help you line. But then Clark cleared his throat, just a tiny sound, and I looked at him. His eyes, those ancient, knowing eyes, were fixed on the kid, not with judgment, but with a deep, quiet understanding. And suddenly I saw the kid differently, not as a type, but as a human being, scared, maybe desperate. What if his story was true? What if he really was stranded? What if he was just like Clark once upon a time before life stripped him bare? It was a moment of hesitation, a split second where the old me and the new me wrestled. It was uncomfortable, like trying to shift gears without the clutch. This truth Clark was talking about, it wasn't just some abstract philosophy. It was forcing me to look at myself, at my own ingrained prejudices, at the walls I'd built around my heart, And that, my friends, is a mirror no man truly wants to stare into, especially when it shows you parts of yourself you'd rather keep hidden. It was making me question every interaction, every assumption, every quick judgment I'd ever made out there on the road. And the unsettling part was, I couldn't stop. The seed was planted, and it was starting to sprout, pushing up through the concrete of my old beliefs. That night, we found a quiet spot to pull over, a little turnout near a forgotten stretch of old Route 66, not far from Joplin. It was one of those places where you could almost hear the ghosts of Model Ts and dusty travelers. Clark had been quiet for a while, just watching the stars. Then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper against the vastness of the night. "You know, Frank," he began, "I used to think the world was a fair place, that if you worked hard, played by the rules, you'd get what you deserved. But life ain't a highway, Frank. There ain't always a clear path, and sometimes the biggest potholes are dug by the very hands you thought were helping you." He then told me about his own ordeal, the one that led him to this life on the road. Not just losing his fortune, but the betrayal. The cold, calculated betrayal by his closest associates, the ones he'd mentored, the ones he'd treated like family. He'd built a successful manufacturing business, provided jobs, supported his community. But when a rival company made an offer, his trusted partners, driven by greed, orchestrated a hostile takeover, using his own kindness and trust against him. They forged documents, spread lies, and systematically stripped him of everything, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a lifetime of lessons learned the hard way. "They didn't just take my money, Frank," he said, his voice laced with a pain that still lingered after all these years. "They took my belief in people. For a long time I hated them, hated the world. But then I realized, hate only eats you alive. The truth, the one no man wants to hear, is that we are all capable of such things. Not just them, but us. The capacity for darkness, for putting self above all else. It's in the human blueprint. But so is the capacity for light, for empathy, for compassion, for reaching out a hand. The real challenge ain't avoiding the darkness. It's choosing the light, even when it feels like you're the only one holding a match." His words were a punch to the gut, but also a strange kind of balm. It wasn't about blaming others anymore. It was about understanding the human condition, the inherent flaws, and the constant choice we all face. I thought about that young kid at the truck stop, and how close I came to just dismissing him. And I realized that Clark wasn't just telling me a truth about the world. He was giving me a chance to see my place in it differently. It was a heavy reward, this new perspective, but one that felt strangely liberating, like shedding a heavy coat I didn't even know I was wearing. The road ahead still stretched into the darkness, but now it felt less like a path to a destination and more like a journey into myself. The next few days on the road were a blur of highway lines and internal wrestling matches. Every time I pulled into a truck stop, every time I saw a fellow driver struggling with a flat or a waitress looking tired, Clark's words were right there, whispering in my ear. It was like he'd installed a new filter on my perception, and suddenly the world wasn't just a series of transactions and deadlines. It was a complex tapestry of human stories, each one carrying its own weight of joy and sorrow, kindness and cruelty. And the hardest part? Realizing how often I'd been on the wrong side of that equation, how many times I'd chosen convenience over compassion, or judgment over understanding. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing I hadn't always been the good man Clark had called me. I remember one afternoon, we were rolling through Oklahoma, past those endless fields of wheat, when my CB crackled to life. It was Smokey, a young hotshot driver I'd had a run-in with a few months back. Kid was always pushing too hard, cutting people off, acting like he owned the road. He'd nearly sideswiped me near Flagstaff, and I'd given him an earful over the air, probably laced with a few choice words. Now, he was calling for help. Said his engine was overheating, stuck on the shoulder about 10 miles ahead. My first instinct, the old Frank, was to just key the mic and say, "Serves you right, hotshot. Learn to drive." A part of me even felt a grim satisfaction. But then I glanced at Clark. He was just looking out the window, but I could feel his presence, his quiet observation. And suddenly the anger felt small, petty. This kid, for all his bravado, was stranded, out there alone, just like Clark had been, just like I could be, any given day. "What would you do, Frank?" I imagined Clark asking, his voice calm. "Choose the easy path of indifference or the harder one of empathy?" I took a deep breath, keyed the mic. "This is Big Rig. Copy that, Smokey. I'm about 10 minutes out. Pull over to the side, I'll take a look. The kid sounded surprised, almost suspicious. You serious, big rig? Serious as a heart attack, son. Just hold tight. Pulling over for him, checking his radiator, sharing some of my water. It felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. But as I watched him drive off waving a grateful hand, a strange warmth spread through me. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about choosing to see the human being, not just the hotshot. And that, I realized, was the real challenge Clark was talking about. Not just hearing the truth, but living it, even when it chafed against every old habit and prejudice. The journey continued, each mile a lesson, each interaction a test. Clark, he was like a silent co-pilot, his wisdom seeping into my bones. He didn't preach, didn't demand. He just observed, occasionally offering a quiet insight that would hit me harder than any sermon. We were making good time through the Texas Panhandle, the vast flat landscape stretching out forever, when we hit a patch of bad weather. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in, turning the highway into a slick, treacherous ribbon. Visibility dropped to near zero and the wind was howling like a banshee trying to rip the trailer right off my rig. I'd driven in worse, but the combination of the storm and Clark's words had me feeling vulnerable. He'd talked about how easily things can be stripped away, how quickly life can change course, and out here, in the middle of nowhere, with the elements raging, that truth felt incredibly real. We pulled into a small, run-down truck stop near Adrian, Texas, right at the midpoint sign of Route 66. It was one of those places that felt like it had been forgotten by time, a relic of a bygone era. Inside, a handful of other drivers were huddled, waiting out the storm, their faces etched with fatigue and frustration. The coffee was weak, the pie was stale, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. I saw a young couple, probably tourists, looking utterly lost and scared, their small car barely visible through the rain-streaked window. They were arguing, their voices low but sharp, clearly at their wits' end. My old self would have just ignored them, focused on my coffee and the weather report. But Clark, he just watched them, his expression unreadable. Then he nudged me. "They're just trying to find their way, Frank," he murmured, "just like everyone else." It was a simple statement, but it cut through the noise. I walked over, offered them a spare map, pointed out a safer route once the storm passed, and even shared some of my road snacks. Their relief was palpable, their gratitude genuine, and as I walked back to my table I felt a shift. It wasn't just about helping, it was about connecting, about seeing their struggle and recognizing the shared human experience. Clark's truth, the one about the capacity for malice, was heavy, but it was balanced by another truth he was subtly revealing, the profound, often overlooked capacity for kindness, for connection, for empathy. It was a tough lesson, seeing the world for what it truly was, but it was also making me a better man, 1 mile at a time. The storm outside raged, but inside, something was settling. Something new was taking root. As we crossed into New Mexico, the landscape shifted, becoming more stark, more ancient. The air grew drier, the sun more intense, and the silence stretched out, broken only by the hum of the tires and the occasional wisdom from Clark. He wasn't just talking about the general malice of humanity anymore. He was getting specific, detailing the subtle ways people manipulate, deceive, and exploit each other, often under the guise of friendship or necessity. He spoke of the invisible chains we forge for ourselves and others, built from expectations, resentments, and unsaid words. "The real prison, Frank," he'd say, gazing out at the vast, empty desert, "ain't made of steel bars. It's built from the lies we tell ourselves and the truths we refuse to face about others." It was heavy stuff, making me feel like I was hauling a load of bricks instead of cargo. I remember one particular stop in Tucumcari, a dusty little town that felt like it was stuck in a time warp. We pulled into a gas station, and as I was fueling up, I saw a familiar face. Snake Eyes Johnson, a dispatcher I'd known for years, always had a reputation for cutting corners, squeezing drivers, and playing favorites. He owed me a good chunk of change from a job he'd shorted me on a few years back, and I'd written it off as a loss. Just another cost of doing business. My blood immediately started to boil. The old Frank would have walked right up to him, demanded his money, maybe even thrown a punch. But then I looked at Clark, who was calmly watching the interaction from the cab. His eyes held no judgment, just a quiet understanding. And suddenly I saw Snake Eyes not just as a cheat, but as a man, probably struggling, probably driven by his own fears and insecurities, just like Clark had described. It didn't excuse his actions, but it changed my reaction. Instead of anger, I felt a strange mix of pity and clarity. I walked over, not to confront him, but just to acknowledge him. "Snake Eyes," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. He flinched, clearly surprised to see me. We exchanged a few pleasantries, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, waiting for the accusation, but it never came. I just nodded, finished fueling, and got back in the truck. Clark gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Sometimes, Frank," he said, "the greatest strength is not in fighting the darkness, but in refusing to let it consume your own light." It was a moment of profound internal shift, a test of my newfound empathy. It wasn't easy, letting go of that old resentment, but it felt like shedding a heavy burden, a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying. The road ahead felt a little lighter, even as the truths Clark shared continued to dig deeper into my soul. The closer we got to Arizona, the more intense Clark's revelations became. He wasn't just talking about general human failings. He was delving into the core of what drives people to act against their own better nature, against the common good. He spoke of fear, of scarcity, of the desperate need for control that turns individuals into oppressors, and how easily even good people can be swayed by the promise of security or power. "The greatest evil, Frank," he explained one evening as we watched the sun set over the painted desert, painting the sky in fiery hues, is often born not of malice, but of fear. Fear of not having enough, fear of not being enough, fear of losing what little you have. And that fear, it makes men do things they never thought they would. His words were a stark reminder that the truth no man wants to hear wasn't just about others. It was about the potential within all of us. We were rolling through a particularly desolate stretch of Route 66 in Arizona, somewhere between Winslow and Flagstaff, a place where the road seemed to stretch into infinity, and the only signs of life were the occasional tumbleweed and the ghosts of old diners. It was a known spot for folks down on their luck to try and catch a ride, a place where the forgotten gathered. As we rounded a bend, I saw a small encampment, a few makeshift shelters, and a handful of figures huddled around a meager fire. My heart sank. Clark had been talking about the desperation that drives people, and here it was, laid bare. One figure, a young woman, maybe early 20s, stepped out onto the road, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow, holding up a cardboard sign that simply read, "Anything helps." My first thought was the usual caution. Don't stop. Too risky. But then I saw Clark's eyes fixed on her, filled with a deep aching sorrow. He didn't say anything, but his gaze spoke volumes. It was a direct challenge to my newfound empathy, a moment where the rubber met the road, so to speak. This wasn't just a theoretical discussion anymore. This was raw, unfiltered human need right there in front of me. I slowed the rig, my hands tightening on the wheel. The old Frank would have sped up, averted his eyes. But the new Frank, the one shaped by Clark's uncomfortable truths, knew he couldn't. This was the ordeal, the moment of confrontation, not with an enemy, but with the very essence of the human condition Clark had been describing. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that whatever I chose to do next would define whether I had truly heard Clark's truth or merely listened to his words. I pulled the iron horse over, the air brakes hissing a familiar tune, but this time it felt different. Not a sound of defiance, but of surrender. Surrender to the truth Clark had been laying out. Surrender to the uncomfortable reality of human suffering. The young woman, seeing the big rig stop, dropped her sign and started walking towards us, a flicker of hope in her eyes that was almost painful to witness. My heart was pounding like a jackhammer. This wasn't just about giving her some money. This was about confronting the raw, exposed nerve of what Clark had been talking about. The indifference, the systems that fail, the sheer desperation that pushes people to the brink. It was the ordeal Clark had prepared me for, a direct challenge to the comfortable cynicism I'd worn for so long. As she approached, I could see the lines of exhaustion etched on her face, the dirt under her fingernails, the threadbare clothes. She looked no older than my own niece. "Please, sir," she rasped, her voice hoarse. "Anything you can spare. We haven't eaten in 2 days." My hand instinctively went for my wallet, but Clark, from the passenger seat, spoke. His voice quiet but firm. Ask her, Frank. Ask her what brought her here. It was a test, I knew it. A test of whether I would truly engage, truly see her, or just throw money at the problem to make myself feel better. I swallowed hard. What happened, ma'am? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She hesitated, then a dam seemed to break. She told us her story, a familiar one on the road, a broken-down car, a job lost, no family to turn to, and a string of bad luck that had left her stranded, miles from anywhere, with nothing but a few meager belongings. She wasn't asking for a handout, she was asking for a lifeline, and in her eyes I saw not just desperation, but a flicker of resilience, a spark that hadn't been extinguished yet. It was a mirror reflecting back the very human essence Clark had been talking about, the vulnerability, the struggle, but also the enduring spirit. It was a moment that stripped away all my preconceived notions, leaving me exposed to the raw truth of another human being's pain. And in that vulnerability, something shifted within me. The walls I'd built, brick by brick, over years of hard road and harder lessons, began to crack, letting in a light I hadn't realized I was missing. I didn't just give her money. I went into my sleeper, pulled out a couple of MREs, some bottled water, and a spare blanket. I even had a small first aid kit, and I offered her some antiseptic for a cut on her hand. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief, then gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." It wasn't just the food or the water, it was the act of being seen, of being treated like a human being, not just another statistic on the side of the road. Clark watched the whole exchange, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. He didn't say "I told you so" or "See, Frank?" He didn't need to. The feeling that washed over me was reward enough. It wasn't the fleeting satisfaction of a good deed. It was a deep, resonant sense of connection, a feeling of being truly alive, truly human. It was the recompense for facing the uncomfortable truth, for choosing empathy over indifference. As we pulled away, leaving the small encampment behind, the desert no longer felt empty. It felt full, brimming with stories, with struggles, with the quiet resilience of people just trying to make it through another day. The storm that had raged earlier had broken, and a sliver of moon was peeking through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the landscape. Clark finally spoke, his voice a gentle murmur. "You see, Frank," he said, "the truth no man wants to hear is that we are all connected, that their pain is our pain and their joy our joy. We build these walls, these illusions of separation, because it's easier. It's easier to ignore, to judge, to pretend we're not part of the same human fabric. But once you truly see it, once you truly feel that connection, there's no going back." He was right. There was no going back. The cynicism, the hardened shell I'd worn, it felt lighter, almost transparent. I still had my schedule, my cargo, my destination, but the purpose of the journey had fundamentally changed. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B anymore. It was about how I traveled, who I saw along the way, and what I chose to do with the truth that had been laid bare before me. The road ahead was still long, but now, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly driving, not just being driven by habit and routine. This encounter, this simple act of stopping, had been my recompense, a profound shift in perspective that would guide every mile to come. The miles after that encounter in the Arizona desert felt different. It wasn't just the hum of the engine or the endless ribbon of asphalt. It was the hum of a new awareness, a constant internal dialogue. Clark, my silent co-pilot, continued to observe, his presence a constant reminder of the truth he'd unveiled. I found myself looking at everything with fresh eyes, the weary faces at truck stops, the impatient drivers cutting me off, even the endless stream of news on the radio. It all seemed to carry a new weight, a new layer of meaning. Clark had shown me the darkness, the capacity for cruelty that lurks in the human heart, but he'd also, subtly, shown me the light, the profound connection that binds us all. The road back wasn't just about heading west. It was about integrating this new, often uncomfortable truth into the fabric of my daily life. I remember one morning, pulling into a diner in Seligman, Arizona, a classic Route 66 spot. Place was packed. I saw a young waitress, probably working 2 jobs, juggling plates, spilling coffee, clearly overwhelmed. My order came out wrong, and the old Frank would have grumbled, maybe even sent it back with a sharp word. But I just watched her, saw the stress lines around her eyes, the way she bit her lip as she rushed past. Clark had talked about the little deaths we inflict, the casual dismissals, and suddenly, my wrong order seemed trivial. When she finally came back to check, I just smiled. "No worries, darling," I said. "Just leave it. You look like you could use a break. Everything all right?" Her eyes widened, surprised. "Oh, sir, I'm so sorry. I'll get you a fresh one right away," she stammered. "No, really," I insisted. "It's fine. Just take a minute. You're doing great." I left her a bigger tip than usual, and as I walked out, I saw her leaning against the counter, taking a deep breath, a small, genuine smile on her face. It was a small thing, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it felt monumental. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate act of empathy, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to ease someone else's burden, however small. This wasn't just about avoiding the darkness. It was about actively choosing to spread a little light. And that, I realized, was the real work of living with Clark's truth. It was hard sometimes to fight the old instincts, the ingrained cynicism, but each time I chose differently, the path felt a little clearer, a little more aligned with the man I was becoming. As we finally crossed into California, the air felt different, charged with the promise of the Pacific. But the real journey wasn't over. Clark's presence, his quiet wisdom, had been a constant guide, leading me not just across the country, but through the landscape of my own soul. The resurrection wasn't going to be a single dramatic event, but a culmination of all those small choices, all those moments of uncomfortable truth and deliberate empathy. It was about facing the final, ultimate test of whether I had truly integrated Clark's lessons, or if they were just fleeting insights. The test came, not with a grand gesture, but in a quiet, insidious way. As I neared San Bernardino, the final leg of my delivery, my dispatcher called. The sensitive cargo I was hauling? Turns out there was a problem. A paperwork mix-up. A bureaucratic snafu meant the delivery was delayed, and I was looking at a significant penalty for the delay, even though it wasn't my fault. The old Frank would have exploded. I would have argued, cursed, threatened to quit. I would have seen it as another example of the system, of them trying to screw us. And for a split second, that old anger flared. My hand hovered over the mic, ready to unleash a torrent of frustration. But then, I saw Clark. He was just looking at me, his eyes calm, unwavering. And in that moment, I heard his voice, not just in my ears, but in my heart. The greatest evil is often born not of malice, but of fear. Fear of not having enough. Fear of not being enough. And I realized this wasn't about me. This was about the person on the other end of the line, probably a low-level clerk, just trying to do their job, caught in a system that often dehumanizes everyone involved. This was my resurrection moment. Could I choose understanding over anger, empathy over self-pity? I took a deep breath, and when I spoke, my voice was calm, steady. "All right," I said. "Let's figure this out. What do we need to do to fix it? No need to yell, we're all just trying to get through this." The dispatcher on the other end sounded genuinely surprised, almost relieved. We worked through it, calmly, professionally. It cost me some time, maybe even a little money, but the peace of mind, the feeling of having chosen the higher road was priceless. It was the ultimate proof that Clark's truth had taken root, transforming me from the inside out. I was still big rig, still hauling freight, but I was also something more. I was a man who had faced the truth no one wants to hear, and emerged, not broken, but resurrected, ready to see the world, and myself, with open eyes and an open heart. The final miles into Santa Monica felt almost surreal. The Pacific shimmered in the distance, sunlight dancing on the waves, the end of the road at last. But I knew, deep down, that the real journey wasn't measured in miles or hours, but in the man I'd become along the way. Clark sat beside me, silent, his presence both grounding and ethereal, like a guardian who'd fulfilled his purpose. As we rolled past the iconic Santa Monica Pier, I felt a strange mix of relief and nostalgia, as if I was leaving behind not just a stretch of highway, but an entire chapter of my life. I parked the Iron Horse near the end of the pier, killed the engine, and just sat there, letting the sounds of the ocean wash over me. Clark turned to me, his eyes softer than I had ever seen them. "You made it, Frank," he said quietly. "But you know, The road never really ends. Every day, every mile, is another chance to choose who you want to be. I looked at him, wanting to say something profound, but all I could manage was a simple, "Thank you." He smiled, that knowing, gentle smile, and for a moment I saw the man he'd once been. The success, the heartbreak, the wisdom earned through loss. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Just pass it on. That's all any of us can do." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip lower, painting the sky in gold and crimson. I thought about all the people I'd met, the moments I'd missed, the words I'd left unsaid. I thought about my family, old friends, even rivals on the road. I realized that the true elixir Clark had given me wasn't just a new perspective. It was the courage to act on it, to reach out, to forgive, to say "I love you" while there's still time, to let go of old grudges and make amends, not because it's easy, but because it's right. Before Clark left, he pressed something into my hand, a battered old photograph of him, years younger, standing with his family beside a shiny new truck. "Remind yourself," he said, "that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind, Frank, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Then he stepped out, blending into the crowd, just another face in the endless flow of humanity. I watched him go, feeling both emptier and fuller at the same time. As I sat there, watching the waves crash against the shore, I realized that my journey wasn't unique. Every driver, every person is on their own road, facing their own trials, carrying their own burdens. The difference is what we choose to carry forward. I started the engine, feeling lighter than I had in years, and pulled away from the pier, ready to face whatever lay ahead, not as the man I was, but as the man I'd become. And if you're listening to this, maybe you'll think twice before judging, before turning away, before letting another day slip by without telling someone you care. Because in the end, that's the only cargo worth hauling. So what about you? Who do you need to forgive? Who do you need to call?